Homeless people do not belong at this table. Get out before I call security. My sister Sydney pointed her perfectly manicured finger at the door, while my mother laughed and my father told me I should be grateful they even let me inside the restaurant. They were celebrating their supposed wealth and my supposed downfall. They had absolutely no idea that the very building they were sitting in belonged to me or that I was about to legally foreclose on their entire life. My name is Clara. I am 33 years old, and I am the CEO of Vanguard Holdings. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch the people who broke you face the consequences of their own actions. Growing up in our affluent suburban household meant constantly chasing a standard I could never reach. My parents valued social status above absolutely everything else, and they made sure I knew it. The crystal chandeliers of Le Rêve cast a warm, shimmering glow over the private dining room. This was universally known as the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the kind of place that required reservations months in advance and demanded a small fortune just to walk through the front doors. I stood silently near the mahogany doorway, holding my coat, trying to process the absolute venom in my sister's voice. Sydney was turning 29 today, and she had demanded nothing short of a royal coronation from our family. My parents, Carol and Richard, sat on either side of her, beaming with pure, unfiltered pride at their golden child. When Sydney told me to get out and called me homeless, Carol actually chuckled and reached for her crystal champagne flute. "We simply did not plan for extra trash at the table today," my mother said smoothly, not even making eye contact with me, as she took a delicate sip of her expensive drink. My father, Richard, nodded firmly, his face set in a rigid expression of disapproval. "You should just be grateful we let you inside the house at all during the holidays," he added harshly. "Do not ruin your sister's big day with your pathetic financial problems." The irony of their arrogant remarks was almost suffocating. I was currently staying in the luxurious penthouse suite of the Four Seasons Hotel downtown. My actual home, an $8 million dual-level penthouse overlooking the entire financial district, was undergoing a massive custom gut renovation. I had temporarily moved into the hotel for 6 months to avoid the endless construction dust and noise. It was a calculated temporary inconvenience while I perfected the crowning jewel of my real estate portfolio. Somehow, through the twisted and malicious grapevine of my family's gossip network, my temporary hotel stay had been completely mistranslated. A distant aunt had seen me leaving the hotel lobby with a single travel bag and immediately assumed I had been evicted from my previous apartment. Within days, my parents and sister had eagerly accepted the rumor that I was completely bankrupt and living on the cold streets. They loved the idea of my failure so much that they never bothered to verify the truth. They reveled in my supposed misery, trading whispers and mocking laughs behind my back because it made them feel superior. The heavy oak door of the private room swung open again and Andre walked in. Andre was Sydney's husband and my parents' absolute favorite person in the entire world. As an African-American man in his early 30s, Andre possessed a natural, magnetic charisma that he weaponized daily to charm everyone he met. He loved holding an audience captive and thrived on constant attention. He desperately needed validation from absolutely everyone he encountered in his life. Tonight he was dressed head to toe in flashy designer logos, desperate to project an image of extreme wealth. He wore an oversized Gucci belt buckle, a loud-patterned Versace blazer, and a chunky gold Rolex that caught the chandelier light every single time he moved his wrist. He looked exactly like a man desperately trying to convince the world he was incredibly successful. "Well, well, well, look who decided to show up to the high rollers table," Andre boomed, clapping his hands together loudly. He walked over and stood uncomfortably close to me, looking me up and down with exaggerated theatrical disgust. I was wearing my favorite unbranded cashmere sweater. It was a Loro Piana piece that cost over $3,000, spun from the finest wool in the world. It had no loud logos or flashy patterns, perfectly fitting my personal philosophy of stealth wealth. To someone like Andre, who measured success entirely by the size of a brand name plastered across his chest, My understated sweater looked like something bought from a discount bin. This visual contrast between us was sharp. He was an empty shell covered in expensive paint, while I was the solid foundation he would soon crash against. Andre let out a loud, mocking laugh and turned to the rest of the family to ensure they were watching his grand performance. My dear sister-in-law, I know the local charity shelters are probably closed for the evening, but you cannot just come in here wearing thrift store trash and expect a free meal. Sydney giggled loudly, leaning affectionately against her husband. My parents joined in their laughter, echoing cruelly off the expensive wood paneling of the private room. I stood there perfectly still, taking steady and controlled breaths, refusing to let them see even a tiny fraction of an emotional response. I knew exactly who Andre really was behind his loud clothes. I knew what his so-called startup company was actually doing behind closed doors. But I needed them to dig their own grave just a little bit deeper before I buried them in it forever. The trap awaits. My father reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his leather wallet. He extracted a single $50 bill, then crumpled it into a tight ball. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the crumpled paper directly at my chest. It bounced off my cashmere sweater and landed on the plush carpet. "Go sit over there," Richard commanded, pointing toward a tiny overflow table, squeezed awkwardly next to the waiter station. "We are taking family photos tonight, and your current situation is going to ruin the aesthetic we want. Grab a cheap appetizer and stay out of the frame." I looked down at the $50 ball of paper resting by my feet. For a fraction of a second, the old version of me, the desperate daughter who wanted her parents to be proud, wanted to scream. That girl wanted to defend herself, to demand basic human respect. But the woman I had become, the CEO, who ruthlessly dismantled failing corporations, knew better than to argue with fools. Arguing gives away your power. Silence makes them reckless. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I calmly bent down, picked up the crumpled $50 bill, and smoothed it out with deliberate precision. I slipped the money into my pocket and walked over to the cramped overflow table. It was barely large enough for a single plate positioned so close to the swinging kitchen doors that I could feel the draft every time a waiter rushed past. I pulled out the chair and sat down perfectly composed. I rested my hands on the table and pulled out my phone. While my family continued to laugh and settle into their plush leather booths, I opened a secure messaging app. I typed a quick message to my executive assistant, Michael. He was already on standby. I told him to bring the physical dossiers. I needed the hard copies of the financial records, the deed transfers, and the compliance reports. I wanted everything printed and ready for display. Michael replied immediately, confirming he was waiting outside the restaurant in my armored SUV. The chess pieces were moving into position exactly as I had anticipated. Across the room, the first course arrived. Waiters carried massive silver trays loaded with seared scallops, imported truffles, and artisan breads. The scent of rich culinary indulgence filled the private dining room. I declined the waiter who approached my small table, ordering only a simple glass of sparkling water. I needed a completely clear head for what was coming. I sat back against the hard wooden chair and watched the main table. They were so absorbed in their own grandiosity that they completely forgot I was even in the room. Their voices carried easily over the soft classical music playing from the hidden ceiling speakers. Carol, my mother, held her glass of expensive vintage wine and leaned toward a group of extended relatives who had flown in specifically for Sydney's birthday. "Let me tell you about my wonderful son-in-law," Carol announced, her voice artificially loud to ensure everyone at the table was paying close attention. "Andre is an absolute visionary in the tech and real estate space. He is revolutionizing the market as we speak. We are incredibly blessed to have a real businessman in the family finally." Andre puffed out his chest, adjusting his flashy designer jacket. He offered a fake humble smile, waving away the praise while clearly soaking up every second of it. "It is just hard work, and knowing how to leverage capital," Andre boasted loudly. "You have to be willing to take big risks to see big rewards in this economy." My mother nodded enthusiastically, tapping her manicured nails against her crystal wine glass. Exactly, she agreed. That is what separates the winners from the losers. You know it breaks my heart to say it, but look at Clara. She gestured vaguely in my direction, without actually turning to look at me. She had everything handed to her on a silver platter. She was enrolled in one of the most prestigious law programs in the entire country. She could have been a highly successful corporate attorney making a respectable living. Sydney chimed in, spearing a scallop with her heavy silver fork. Instead, she dropped out to play pretend business. What was that little company you tried to start, Clara? Vanguard something. It sounded like a fake bank to me. Carol sighed deeply, shaking her head in mock sorrow. Vanguard Holdings. Yes, she dropped out of law school to build a private equity firm. Can you imagine the sheer delusion? A young girl thinking she could walk into the aggressive financial sector and compete with seasoned professionals. I told her it was a guaranteed failure. I told her we would cut her off financially if she threw her expensive education away. And we did just that. We had to practice tough love. But did she listen to us? No, she threw her future away to do God knows what, and now she is living in a hotel because she cannot afford a permanent address. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I listened to my mother rewrite history with stunning arrogance. They had indeed cut off my tuition funding when I decided law school was not my true path. They had abandoned me completely, hoping financial ruin would force me to crawl back and beg for their conditional forgiveness. Instead, I had taken the minimal savings I had built a ruthless investment strategy and started buying up distressed debt. I had worked 20-hour days analyzing complex market trends and executing aggressive acquisitions. Vanguard Holdings was not a fake bank. It was a multi-billion-dollar private equity powerhouse that owned significant portions of the commercial real estate in this very city. They dismissed my life work as a failure simply because it did not fit their narrow, suffocating definition of success. Let them talk. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open again, and the head waiter approached the main table with profound reverence. Sydney commanded the room, completely ignoring my presence in the shadowy corner. She tossed her glossy hair over her shoulder and snatched the leather-bound menu from the table. She did not even bother to look at the prices. She loudly ordered the A5 Wagyu tomahawk steaks for everyone at the table, ensuring her voice carried enough to impress the extended relatives sitting around her. She demanded 3 full ounces of the imperial beluga caviar simply for their starting appetizers. She told the waiter she wanted it served with the traditional mother-of-pearl spoons and warm blinis. Carol beamed with absolute pride, leaning over to pat Sydney on the arm. "You deserve nothing but the absolute best for your birthday," my darling mother cooed loudly. Richard nodded in firm agreement, adjusting his silk tie. "This is exactly how successful people are supposed to dine," he announced, casting a brief look of disgust in my direction, before returning his attention to his golden child. Sydney was practically vibrating with arrogance. She stood up slightly and raised her crystal water glass to clink it against Andre's glass. She announced to the entire room that this dinner was not merely a celebration of her turning 29. It was also a massive victory dinner for her brilliant husband. She boasted that Andre's real estate technology startup had just secured an astronomical new round of institutional funding. She claimed top-tier venture capitalists had poured millions of dollars into his company because they recognized his unparalleled genius. She tossed around hollow business buzzwords she clearly did not understand, babbling proudly about blockchain property integration and algorithmic market disruption. The extended relatives clapped their hands and offered loud congratulations. Andre nodded along, playing the part of the humble billionaire perfectly. He kissed Sydney on the cheek and thanked her for her unwavering support. I took another slow sip of my water, watching the entire theatrical performance unfold from my tiny overflow table near the kitchen doors. The sommelier arrived, pushing a silver cart holding a silver ice bucket. Sydney had specifically requested a bottle of Dom Perignon vintage champagne to start the festivities. From my isolated seat, I recognized the distinct label instantly. It was a rare vintage we specifically stocked for insecure clients trying to flaunt their status. As the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, the private equity firm that had quietly purchased the hospitality group managing this exact restaurant 6 months ago. I knew the precise financial breakdown of every single item hitting their table. The Wagyu beef they ordered was imported directly through one of my own global supply chain subsidiaries. But the champagne was the real financial trap. The wholesale cost of that specific bottle was barely $200. The restaurant markup printed on the menu they held was an aggressive $800. Sydney was ordering pure ego, paying a massive premium just to look wealthy in front of her aunts and uncles. I did the math effortlessly in my head. With the imported caviar, the premium steaks, and the expensive wine, their dinner bill was already crossing the $4,000 mark in the first 20 minutes of the evening. The first bottle of champagne emptied rapidly as the family drank deep from the cup of Sydney's perceived success. Sydney snapped her fingers at the sommelier, treating him like a common servant. She demanded a second bottle be brought out immediately, and then arrogantly told him to bring a third bottle just to keep on standby in the ice bucket. That was the exact moment I saw it. I shifted my gaze away from my loud sister and locked my eyes entirely on Andre. The charismatic, invincible mask he wore so perfectly slipped for a tiny fraction of a second. When Sydney shouted the order for the third bottle, causing the bill to surge by another $1,600, Andre tightened his jaw. I watched a single heavy bead of sweat form at his temple and roll slowly down his cheek. His dark eyes darted nervously down to the menu resting near his plate, quickly calculating the mounting total. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing against the collar of his flashy designer shirt. His hand, which had been resting confidently on the back of Sydney's chair, dropped suddenly into his lap. Beneath the edge of the crisp, white tablecloth, I could see his fingers beginning to tap anxiously against his thigh in a rapid, erratic rhythm. He forced a wide, fake smile back onto his face when Richard leaned over and patted him heavily on the back, but the damage was already done. The illusion was breaking right in front of me. Real wealth does not sweat over a restaurant bill. A man who just secured millions of dollars in venture capital funding does not panic over a few extra bottles of champagne. A true tech visionary does not calculate the cost of a birthday dinner with absolute terror hidden deep in his eyes. Andre was drowning, and the water was rising incredibly fast. His flashy clothes and loud boasts were nothing but heavy weights pulling him under the surface. I remained perfectly still at my tiny table, my expression completely neutral as I watched the fraudulent foundation of my family's pride begin to silently crumble. I did not need to say a single word or raise my voice to defend my own honor. I just needed to sit back, observe his panic, and let my incredibly arrogant sister keep ordering the most expensive items on the menu. The waiter cleared the appetizer plates, and Andre decided it was his exact moment to strike. He picked up a heavy silver spoon and tapped it sharply against the rim of his crystal champagne flute. The high ringing sound cut clearly through the low hum of conversation and the soft classical music playing overhead. Everyone at the main table immediately stopped talking and turned their undivided attention to him. Sydney looked up at her husband with absolute adoration, resting her chin on her hands as if she were about to listen to the greatest speech ever written in human history. Carol and Richard leaned forward, mirroring her eager expression. I remained perfectly still at my overflow table watching the performance begin. Andre cleared his throat, smoothing the lapels of his loud designer jacket, and flashed his trademark charismatic smile. He started by raising his glass to Sydney, praising her beauty and her unwavering support. He called her the rock of his life and the inspiration behind all of his success. It sounded like a standard birthday toast at first, but the pivot happened almost instantly. The warmth in his voice shifted into a practiced, polished cadence. He was no longer a loving husband celebrating his wife. He was a salesman standing on a stage. I want to take this beautiful occasion to share something monumental with the people who matter most to me, Andre announced, projecting his voice, so the extended relatives hanging on his every word would not miss a single syllable. Sydney and I have been incredibly blessed this year, but my vision has always been about elevating the entire family together. That is why I am thrilled to announce that my real estate technology platform is officially opening a highly exclusive friends and family investment round. A ripple of excited murmurs swept across the main table. Richard puffed out his chest, looking around proudly, as if he had personally mentored Andre. Carol clapped her hands together, emitting a high-pitched sound of delight. Andre began pacing slightly behind Sydney's chair, commanding the room. He spoke passionately about revolutionizing the property market by leveraging decentralized algorithmic trading protocols. He claimed his proprietary software could guarantee a 20% monthly return by flipping distressed digital assets and tokenizing commercial real estate portfolios. He threw around heavy buzzwords, effortlessly stringing together phrases like market disruption, liquidity pooling, and hyper-growth scaling. He promised everyone at the table that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a billion-dollar unicorn before the institutional investors locked them out forever. I sat in the shadows near the kitchen doors, feeling a sharp jolt of pure disbelief course through my veins. The sparkling water I had just swallowed felt heavy in my throat. I knew those exact words. I knew that exact sequence of technical buzzwords. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, retrieving a very specific memory from exactly 3 weeks ago. I had been sitting in my corner office at Vanguard Holdings overlooking the financial district, reviewing a stack of Series A funding requests my analysts had flagged for potential acquisition. One particular pitch deck had caught my eye for all the wrong reasons. It was bound in glossy black leather full of flashy graphics and entirely devoid of actual financial substance. The company name was Apex Property Solutions. The founder was listed as Andre, with a heavily airbrushed headshot matching the man currently speaking. As I listened to him pitch my family, I mentally recited the next lines of his speech, right along with him predicting every dramatic pause and every hollow promise. He was delivering the pitch deck word for word, matching the exact fraudulent document I had read in my office. When that glossy black binder had crossed my massive glass desk at Vanguard Holdings, I had spent exactly 4 minutes analyzing the underlying financial model. My entire career was built on identifying distressed assets and dismantling corporate fraud. I have a predatory instinct for detecting financial lies. Andre's business model was not a revolutionary tech startup. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, stripped down to its most basic predatory elements. His proprietary algorithm did not exist. The tokenized commercial real estate portfolios were completely fabricated. He was using the illusion of complex digital jargon to mask a very simple operation. He took money from new investors to pay fake dividends to earlier investors, while skimming massive management fees off the top to fund his flashy designer wardrobe and expensive restaurant dinners. There was no actual product. There was no real estate. There was only a hollow shell designed to siphon cash from gullible people who wanted to get rich quick without understanding the mechanics of the market. When I finished reading his fraudulent proposal 3 weeks ago, I had personally stamped it, rejected, and tossed it directly into the shredder bin beside my desk. I had even flagged his name in our internal compliance database to ensure Vanguard Holdings never accidentally engaged with his fake enterprise. Now I sat perfectly still as the man whose financial death warrant I had signed 3 weeks ago pitched his illegal scam to my own parents. Andre kept talking, his voice rising with theatrical passion. He told the aunts and uncles sitting around the table that the friends and family round was strictly capped to preserve equity. He emphasized that they needed to wire their investment funds by the end of the week to secure their ownership stakes before the window closed forever. This was the classic false urgency tactic used by every con artist to prevent their victims from conducting proper due diligence. Richard was practically salivating, nodding vigorously as Andre promised massive returns that defied all economic logic. Carol was already whispering to a relative about how much they should contribute from their savings. They were blindly walking into a financial slaughterhouse, lured by a man wearing a fake smile and an overpriced suit. They believed they were investing in a brilliant visionary. They believed they were securing their future. They had absolutely no idea that the silent daughter they had banished to the overflow table was the very same private equity CEO who had already proven his entire life was a criminal lie. I watched them hang on his every word, knowing the absolute devastation that was waiting for them just around the corner. The trap was not just set anymore, it was actively snapping shut. Andre finished his pitch, taking his seat next to Sydney while the family erupted into applause. My father, Richard, pushed his chair back and stood up, raising his crystal glass. He commanded the table, puffing his chest with unearned confidence, wanting everyone to know he was a key player. "Listen to me, everyone," Richard announced, his voice echoing. "Carol and I have never been fools when recognizing a golden financial opportunity. We know a visionary when we see one. We did not sit on the sidelines while Andre revolutionized the real estate market. We took decisive action and are officially lead investors in this round." Impressed whispers went around the table as Sydney beamed with pride, resting her hand on Andre's shoulder. I sat in my dark corner watching my father inflate his ego. I knew he did not have the liquid capital to be a lead investor. His middle management salary and my mother's extravagant spending meant they lived entirely on credit. I took a slow bite of my salad, waiting to hear how he funded this delusion. "We bypassed our retirement funds entirely," Richard continued proudly. "Those traditional accounts moved too slowly for the modern economy. We needed real capital to secure our ownership stake in Andre's company. So we took out a second mortgage on the family home. We pulled out exactly $500,000 in cash and handed it directly to Andre." My hand froze instantly. The heavy silver fork slipped through my numb fingers and crashed violently against my porcelain plate. The sharp ringing sound shattered the celebratory atmosphere, piercing through the soft background music. It felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. $500,000. A second mortgage on the family home. That house was not just residential real estate. It was the only pure, meaningful thing left in our bloodline. My late grandfather worked grueling construction jobs for 40 years, breaking his back to pay off that property. He built the back deck with his own hands. That house represented decades of honest, agonizing labor. It was supposed to be the impenetrable bedrock of our family legacy, passed down through generations. My grandfather explicitly trusted Richard to protect that vital asset. Instead, my father recklessly leveraged the only meaningful thing our family owned and handed $500,000 in raw cash to a fraudster. The sheer financial stupidity of his action was staggering. To extract that much home equity quickly, he had to bypass traditional banks and use a shadow lender. He likely went to an aggressive private equity firm that specialized in high-interest predatory loans. He had effectively placed a ticking time bomb inside my grandfather's legacy to impress a man running a Ponzi scheme. The loud clatter of my fork dropping had drawn the judging eyes of the entire table. The extended relatives turned to look at my tiny overflow table, their expressions a mix of pity and annoyance. My mother, Carol, slammed her wine glass down on the table so hard the liquid sloshed over the rim. She glared at me with an intensity that could melt solid steel. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits of pure, venomous rage. "Do not act so shocked, Clara," my mother snapped, her voice dripping with disgust. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my face, ensuring everyone heard her next words clearly. "We cut your college funds because you were a lost cause. You threw away a prestigious law program to play pretend business, and we knew you would never amount to anything. We refused to waste another dime on a pathetic failure. Thank God we saved that money for a real businessman." The vicious words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She was openly bragging about abandoning my education to fund my sister's husband. She was weaponizing my supposed failure as the justification for their massive financial gamble. The relatives nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring their approval of my parents practicing tough love. They all blindly believed the false narrative that I was a hopeless dropout, while Andre was the brilliant savior who deserved their complete financial devotion. I looked at my mother sitting there in her expensive dress bought on borrowed credit. I looked at my father puffing his chest with false pride. I looked at Sydney and Andre soaking up the adulation built entirely on stolen money. The profound pain of their betrayal was a sharp physical ache in my chest. They actively sacrificed my future to fund their delusions of grandeur. They took the financial safety net my grandfather worked his entire life to build and set it on fire just to warm themselves in the glow of Andre's fake success. I did not pick up my fallen fork. I placed my hands flat on the small table, feeling the cool wood beneath my palms to ground myself. The burning anger rising inside me was no longer hot or chaotic. It was freezing cold and perfectly clear. My mother genuinely thought she was delivering the ultimate insult to break my spirit. She thought she had finally put me in my rightful place, cementing my status as the ultimate family disgrace. She was absolutely certain that handing $500,000 to Andre was the smartest financial decision she had ever made. She had no idea she had just confessed to signing her own financial death warrant in front of an audience. She had no idea the real businessman she was praising was going to leave them destitute and facing federal charges. And she certainly had no idea that the lost cause, sitting silently in the corner, was the only person with the power to save them from ruin. I stared right back into my mother's glaring eyes, absorbing every ounce of her cruelty, storing it away for the exact moment I would need it. The foundation of their life was completely gone, and they were happily dancing on the roof, unaware the house was already collapsing beneath their feet. I pushed my chair back from the tiny overflow table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor, causing a few relatives to glance in my direction. I did not care. I stood up and smoothed the front of my cashmere sweater. I had spent the last 5 years letting them believe their own lies, but I could not sit in the shadows and watch my grandfather's legacy be dismantled by a con artist. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the center of the private dining room. The conversation at the main table died down as I approached. My father Richard narrowed his eyes, a vein pulsing in his forehead. My mother Carol let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure annoyance. Sydney crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at me like I was a pest ruining her perfect birthday aesthetic. I stopped right behind Andre's chair. I looked directly at my parents. "You need to listen to me right now," I said, my voice steady and echoing with absolute authority. "Do not wire that $500,000. Do not sign any more paperwork. Apex Property Solutions is not a real estate technology platform. It is an unregistered, illegal shell company operating entirely outside the boundaries of the Securities and Exchange Commission." The entire table froze. Sydney uncrossed her arms, her jaw dropping in shock. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. Andre stiffened his broad shoulders, freezing under his flashy designer jacket. I did not give them a single second to interrupt me. I broke down the fraudulent business model with surgical precision. "The decentralized algorithmic trading protocols Andre just pitched to you do not exist," I stated clearly, locking eyes with my father. "He is not tokenizing commercial real estate portfolios because he does not own any commercial real estate. He holds zero physical assets. His company has no active revenue streams, no verifiable liquidity pools, and zero audited financial statements. The massive funding rounds he brags about are completely fabricated. You are dealing with a textbook Ponzi scheme. He is using the illusion of complex digital jargon to mask a predatory operation. He takes fresh capital from new investors like you to pay fake dividends to earlier victims, creating the false appearance of profit. Your $500,000 from the second mortgage is not going into a tech startup. It is going directly into offshore crypto accounts to fund his luxury lifestyle and pay off his mounting personal debts. If you proceed with this transaction, you will lose the house grandfather built, and you will face absolute financial ruin." For 10 agonizing seconds, the private dining room was dead silent. The heavy weight of my legal and financial breakdown hung over the crystal glasses and expensive plates of Wagyu beef. I had laid out the exact truth, stripping away the shiny veneer of his fraudulent empire. Then the table erupted into total chaos. Sydney slammed her hands flat on the table, causing the silverware to rattle violently. "How dare you!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. "You are completely insane. You are making up psychotic lies because you are a pathetic failure." Carol gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace as if she were having a heart attack. Richard stood up, pointing a trembling finger right at my face, demanding that I shut my mouth and get out of the restaurant immediately. The extended relatives began murmuring in outraged whispers, shaking their heads at my supposed audacity. But it was Andre who delivered the masterclass in manipulation. He did not shout. He did not lose his temper. Instead, he stood up slowly, adjusting his gold Rolex, and placed a gentle restraining hand on Sydney's shoulder to calm her down. He looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured pity. He placed his other hand flat over his heart, playing the role of the deeply wounded honorable gentleman. The room quieted down immediately, captivated by his charismatic performance. "Clara," he began, his voice dripping with artificial sorrow. "I always knew you held a deep resentment toward me, but I never imagined it ran this dark. It truly breaks my heart to see you stoop to such ugly, desperate tactics." He turned to address the wider audience of aunts, uncles, and my furious parents. His tone was perfectly calibrated to elicit maximum sympathy. "We all know how difficult it is for a proud, established family to welcome an outsider," Andre said softly, shaking his head. "And we all know the unfortunate reality of what happens when a successful African-American man enters a space traditionally reserved for others. I have had to fight for every single milestone in my career. I have faced boardrooms full of people who looked at me just like Clara is looking at me right now, hoping to see a criminal instead of a CEO." Carol gasped again, this time in horror at my supposed prejudice. "Oh, Andre, no!" she cried out, reaching across the table. "We do not think like that. She is just a bitter girl." Andre offered my mother a brave, forgiving smile before turning back to me. "It is a tragedy, Clara. You dropped out of law school. You failed to launch a career. You are sitting here single and 33 years old, watching your younger sister celebrate a beautiful marriage and a booming business. I understand that my success highlights your failures. I understand that a black man building a multi-million-dollar real estate empire shatters your narrow worldview. But trying to tear down my legitimate company with these bitter, racially motivated accusations is beneath you. It is a sad, lonely, desperate cry for attention from a woman who has nothing else going for her. The backlash from my family was immediate and entirely predictable. They swallowed his narrative, completely eager to brand me as a racist, jealous spinster, rather than admit they had been conned out of their life savings." Richard slammed his fist on the table. "You are a disgrace to this family, Clara. Andre is a brilliant visionary, and you are nothing but a jealous failure trying to ruin his hard-earned success." Sydney sneered at me, her eyes flashing with triumphant malice. "You are just mad that Andre is providing me with the luxury lifestyle you can never afford," she spat. "You are a miserable single dropout living in a hotel, and you want everyone else to be as miserable as you are. You cannot stand seeing a successful black man treat me like a queen." The extended relatives nodded their heads, casting glares of disgust in my direction. Andre had brilliantly weaponized the current social climate, using his race and my single status as an impenetrable shield against my financial facts. He had successfully spun my legitimate warning into an ugly, hateful attack, ensuring that no one at the table would ever believe a single word I said. They looked at him with absolute reverence, and they looked at me like I was a monster. They actively chose the charming fraudster over their own flesh and blood. I stood there absorbing the full force of their hatred, realizing that trying to save them was the biggest mistake of the night. Sydney was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with theatrical indignation. For her, this was not about the financial warning I had just delivered. It was never about the money or the impending ruin of our family legacy. It was about the spotlight. This was her 29th birthday dinner, an event she had meticulously curated to showcase her perfect life, her perfect marriage, and her perfect status. I had dared to interrupt her crowning moment. By stepping forward and demanding the room listen to my financial analysis, I had pulled the eyes of every single extended relative away from her and placed them firmly onto myself. That was the one ultimate, unforgivable sin in Sydney's mind. She could not stand sharing the stage, let alone losing it entirely to the sister she deemed a worthless outcast. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure resentment. She looked at Andre, who was still playing the role of the wounded martyr, and then glared back at me. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from an overwhelming surge of spoiled entitlement. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers curl around the stem of her crystal wine glass. It was filled to the brim with the $500 Cabernet she had ordered earlier. The dark ruby liquid sloshed dangerously against the delicate glass walls as she gripped it tighter. "You always do this," Clara Sidney hissed, her voice shaking with raw malice. "You always try to ruin my happiness because you are so bitterly jealous. You cannot stand that Andre loves me. You cannot stand that my life is a beautiful success while you are a miserable, lonely failure." Before I could even process the warning signs in her body language, Sydney abruptly stood up from her chair. She did not just toss the wine. She pulled her arm back and violently hurled the entire contents of the heavy crystal glass directly at my chest. The red liquid flew through the air in a dramatic arc. It hit me squarely in the center of my torso, soaking instantly into the delicate fibers of my unbranded Loro Piana cashmere sweater. The sheer force of the splash sent droplets flying across my collarbone and the side of my neck. The expensive vintage wine felt shockingly cold against my skin. It rapidly bled downward, staining the pale, luxurious wool with a massive, ugly purple and black blotch. The sweater, which cost $3,000 and represented my quiet, hard-earned success, was completely ruined in a fraction of a second. A collective gasp echoed through the private dining room. Several aunts covered their mouths in shock, while the uncles shifted uncomfortably in their heavy leather chairs. For a fleeting moment, there was absolute silence, save for the sound of wine dripping from my hem onto the polished hardwood floor. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to shield myself. I looked down at the spreading stain and then looked back up at my sister. Her chest was heaving, but a triumphant, malicious smirk was already forming on her lips. She felt entirely justified in her physical assault. "Oh my goodness!" Carol cried out, shattering the brief silence. My mother leaped up from her seat, but she did not rush toward me. She did not offer me a napkin or ask if I was all right. Instead, she rushed directly to Sydney, placing a protective arm around her golden child. "Look what you made your sister do!" Carol shrieked, glaring at me with absolute fury. "You pushed her to the breaking point, Clara. You came into this restaurant tonight with the sole intention of causing a scene and ruining her special birthday. You always ruin absolutely everything." I stared at my mother, letting her twisted logic wash over me. I was the one standing there dripping with red wine, assaulted in front of 20 people, but in my mother's eyes, I was the aggressor. I had forced Sydney to humiliate me. "She is so stressed out now," Carol continued, softly petting Sydney's hair while shooting daggers at me. "Andre is trying to build a beautiful future for this family, and you attack him with these psychotic delusions. You should be ashamed of yourself, Clara. You are a toxic presence." Richard stepped forward, pushing his chair in with a loud, aggressive scrape against the floor. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked at me with an expression of profound disgust. He looked at the massive red stains spreading across my chest and wrinkled his nose as if I were a piece of garbage that had washed up on his pristine shoreline. "Look at you," Richard sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You look exactly like a homeless beggar standing there dripping on the floor. You are an embarrassment to the family name. I will not have you standing in this private room looking like a street vagrant while we are trying to enjoy a sophisticated evening." He pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy oak doors leading out to the main restaurant corridor. "Get out of here right now," Richard commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Go to the public bathroom and clean yourself up." Scrub that cheap sweater in the sink and do not dare show your face back in this dining room until you look presentable. In fact, maybe you should just leave the restaurant entirely and go back to whatever shelter you crawled out of. You have done enough damage for one night. Andre remained seated, offering a silent, supportive nod to my father, while casting a smug, victorious glance in my direction. He knew he had won this round. He had successfully manipulated my family into physically and verbally attacking me. I turned on my heel and walked out of the private dining room without a single backward glance. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, severing the sounds of their triumphant laughter. I navigated the dimly lit opulent corridor of Le Rêve, keeping my posture perfectly straight. A passing waiter holding a silver tray of champagne flutes paused, and his eyes widened at the massive dark stain spreading across my chest. I offered him a polite brief nod and continued walking. I pushed open the frosted glass door to the women's luxury restroom and stepped inside, locking it securely behind me. The space was completely empty, a sanctuary of white Carrara marble gold fixtures and soft ambient lighting. I walked over to the expansive vanity and looked at my reflection in the gilded mirror. The deep red wine had soaked completely through the pale cashmere, sticking uncomfortably to my skin and emitting the sharp, acidic scent of fermented grapes. Any other woman might have broken down right there. Any other daughter standing in a public bathroom covered in a humiliating stain inflicted by her own sister would have cried. I did not shed a single tear. My heart rate was completely steady. My breathing was perfectly controlled. I was not a victim seeking comfort. I was an apex predator observing a trap springing shut. I turned the heavy brass faucet, allowing the warm water to run over my hands. I selected a thick, folded linen hand towel from the silver basket on the counter and dampened it carefully. I pressed the wet cloth against the center of my chest, blotting the excess wine. The $3,000 sweater was permanently ruined, but that was merely a tiny collateral expense in the grand scheme of the evening. As I rhythmically dabbed at the fabric, my mind operated with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a supercomputer processing millions of data points per second. I had genuinely tried to offer them an exit strategy. I had laid out the exact financial reality of Andre's fraudulent enterprise, hoping basic survival instinct would override their blind arrogance. Instead, they had doubled down. They had chosen the charismatic con artist who dressed in loud logos over the daughter who had actually built a legitimate empire. Sydney had assaulted me. My mother had blamed me. My father had banished me. They had gleefully burned down the bridge of family loyalty to warm themselves by the fire of Andre's fake success. I tossed the stained linen towel into the brass receptacle beneath the sink. The time for warnings had officially expired. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of wealth and power, but they had absolutely no idea they were sitting at my table playing with my chips. A sharp vibration against my hip broke my train of thought. I reached into my tailored trousers and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. The screen illuminated, displaying a secure message from Michael, my executive assistant. He was highly efficient, entirely discreet, and operated with military precision. The text read simply that the package was secured, and he was waiting by the private valet exit adjacent to the restroom corridor. I dried my hands on a fresh towel, smoothed my damp sweater, and stepped back out into the quiet hallway. I bypassed the main dining area entirely and pushed open the heavy security door leading to the private alleyway reserved for VIP guests. The crisp night air hit my face instantly, cooling the damp spots on my clothing. A black armored SUV sat idling quietly against the brick wall. The tinted rear window rolled down smoothly, and Michael stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, holding a thick black leather briefcase securely against his side. "Good evening, boss," Michael said, his voice low and perfectly professional. He did not even blink at the massive wine stain covering my torso. He handed me the heavy briefcase. The compliance team worked through dinner. "We have the physical Vanguard Holdings dossier on Apex Property Solutions completely finalized. We also expedited the real estate division records. I have the certified deed transfers and the predatory loan contracts for your father's second mortgage right here. I took the briefcase, resting it on the hood of the SUV, and popped the dual combination locks. I lifted the lid and pulled out a sleek black folder, embossed with the Vanguard Holdings insignia. I flipped open the cover to review the arsenal I was about to unleash. The first set of documents detailed Andre's entire shell company structure. There were comprehensive bank traces proving every single dollar invested in his supposed real estate technology platform was immediately funneled into offshore cryptocurrency wallets and illegal online gambling syndicates. The financial forensics were absolutely undeniable. He was a textbook criminal operating on borrowed time. I turned to the second section of the folder. There lay the original promissory notes and the deed of trust for the house my grandfather built. My father had signed a highly aggressive subprime loan agreement with a shadow lender to extract that $500,000 for Andre. He had agreed to a massive balloon payment that was already 2 weeks overdue because Andre had drained his liquid cash. I traced my finger over the final document in the stack. It was the official assignment of debt. The shadow lender had bundled and sold their distressed debts to a private equity firm. That private equity firm was a direct subsidiary, completely owned and operated by Vanguard Holdings. I legally owned my parents' debt. I owned the mortgage on their home. The trap was fully set, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. I closed the folder, secured the briefcase, and handed it back to Michael, taking only the essential documents with me. "Keep the engine running, Michael," I instructed calmly. "The authorities are on standby, and this will not take much longer." I turned around and walked back into the restaurant, ready to return to the private dining room and execute my checkmate. They wanted to humiliate the homeless dropout in front of their wealthy friends. I was going to show them exactly what a real eviction looked like in the corporate world. I stepped back through the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, holding the sleek black folder tightly against my side. The atmosphere inside had shifted from aggressive hostility to a gluttonous, lazy satisfaction. The extended relatives were leaning back in their leather chairs, patting their stomachs, and swirling the last remnants of their expensive vintage wine. Sydney was picking at a slice of gold leaf chocolate cake, acting as if she had not just violently assaulted her own sister. My father, Richard, and my mother, Carol, were engaged in deep conversation with Andre hanging on his every word as he spun more elaborate lies about his fabricated real estate empire. I walked quietly across the plush carpet and took my seat at the tiny overflow table near the waiter station. I placed the Vanguard Holdings dossier flat on my lap, hidden safely beneath the pristine white tablecloth. The massive, dark purple wine stain on my cashmere sweater was still damp and highly visible, but I wore it like a badge of absolute authority. A few aunts glanced in my direction, whispering behind their hands, but they quickly looked away when I met their gaze with a dead flat stare. I was no longer the humiliated dropout they thought they knew. I was the executioner waiting patiently for the corporate guillotine to drop. The extravagant birthday feast was finally drawing to a close. The waitstaff moved silently around the main table, clearing away the heavy debris of their massive culinary indulgence. Empty oyster shells, smeared caviar plates, and the stripped bones of 5 Wagyu tomahawk steaks littered the expensive white linen. 4 empty bottles of Dom Perignon sat upside down in melting ice buckets, a sparkling testament to Sydney's desperate need to consume wealth she did not actually possess. The room smelled heavily of roasted garlic, truffle oil, and expensive perfume. Andre leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his flashy designer jacket to reveal his crisp silk shirt. He looked like a king surveying his newly conquered territory. He had successfully manipulated my parents into handing over $500,000 from a predatory second mortgage, and he had managed to turn the entire extended family against me in the process. He was flying incredibly high on a dangerous, toxic cocktail of stolen money and unchecked arrogance. Sydney rested her head on his broad shoulder, playing the part of the adoring wealthy wife, while Carol beamed at them with sickening pride. They were all completely intoxicated by the grand illusion of their own elite status. The heavy double doors opened, and the restaurant general manager stepped into the private dining room. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man who carried himself with absolute rigid professionalism. He held a thick black leather folder in his right hand containing the final tally for the evening. As the owner of the hospitality group that managed Le Rêve, I knew exactly how our high-end billing system worked. The manager bypassed the regular waitstaff, choosing to deliver this specific check personally due to its sheer astronomical magnitude. He walked straight toward the head of the massive table where Richard was sitting. My father puffed out his chest, reaching for his wallet with a self-important smirk spreading across his face. He wanted to prove to the extended family that he could effortlessly afford to host such a lavish celebration. But before the manager could even place the leather folder on the smooth table surface, Andre shot out of his seat. He intercepted the manager, snatching the black folder right out of his hands with a loud theatrical laugh. "Absolutely not!" Richard Andre boomed, his voice echoing off the acoustic wood-paneled walls. "I will not allow you to pay for a single crumb tonight. This incredible dinner is entirely on me." Andre opened the leather folder and glanced at the final receipt. The bold printed number at the bottom of the page read exactly $15,000. For a fraction of a second, I saw his jaw tighten. That was a truly astronomical sum for a single meal, even for legitimate millionaires. But Andre quickly masked his internal panic with another booming laugh. He held the receipt up high, waving it in the air like a massive victory flag. $15,000 is an absolute bargain for a night like this, Andre announced to the room, ensuring every single relative was listening closely. "I am covering this entire feast to celebrate my brilliant new investors. Richard and Carol, you have shown incredible faith in my real estate technology platform today. Your $500,000 investment is going to change the trajectory of this entire family forever. Tonight we celebrate our partnership and our beautiful, lucrative future together." The extended relatives clapped and cheered, raising their empty glasses in a loud tribute. Andre reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy platinum credit card. He held it delicately between his fingers, ensuring the metallic surface caught the bright chandelier light so everyone could see its prestigious tier. He tossed the platinum card onto the silver tray, held by the manager with a highly arrogant flick of his wrist. "Keep the change," he added, winking at the manager. Then Andre turned his body completely away from his adoring audience and locked his dark eyes directly on me. He stared at me sitting alone at the tiny overflow table, with my ruined stained sweater and my plain glass of tap water. He tilted his head slightly, flashing me a smug, condescending grin that practically screamed victory. He wanted me to feel incredibly small. He wanted me to feel utterly defeated by his grand display of ultimate financial power. He wanted me to know that he had completely won over my family, my parents, and their money. I did not break eye contact. I looked at his platinum card resting on the silver tray. I looked back at his smug, confident face. I kept my hands folded perfectly still over the hidden dossier on my lap, and I waited patiently for the automated banking system to do its glorious job. The manager nodded and turned on his heel, carrying the silver tray with Andre's platinum card out of the private room. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, sealing us back inside this opulent bubble of manufactured wealth. Once the manager left, the tension evaporated entirely for everyone except me. The extended relatives immediately resumed their loud, enthusiastic chatter. Uncles patted Andre on the back, praising his incredible generosity, while aunts leaned across the white linen tablecloth to compliment Sydney on finding such an exceptional provider. Sydney was absolutely glowing, basking in the validation she had craved her entire life. She signaled a passing busboy to pour the last few drops of the expensive vintage champagne into her crystal flute, acting as though she owned the very establishment we were sitting in. "Carol?" My mother smiled so widely, it looked painful, projecting the image of the ultimate successful matriarch. "Richard." My father puffed his chest out further, looking around the room to ensure every single relative properly registered his new elevated status as a lead investor in a major technology venture. I sat perfectly still at my tiny overflow table near the kitchen draft. I kept my breathing slow and measured my hands resting flat against the hidden Vanguard Holdings dossier on my lap. I knew exactly how the digital point of sale systems operated in this restaurant because my private equity firm had personally upgraded the entire payment infrastructure 6 months ago. An authorization request for a $15,000 transaction would take approximately 14 seconds to ping the banking servers passed through the high-tier fraud algorithms and return a definitive status code to the terminal. I counted the seconds in my head, watching the heavy oak doors. I knew that Andre was running a blatant Ponzi scheme. I knew he had funneled my parents $500,000 into offshore cryptocurrency wallets to cover his aggressive personal debts. I knew that Platinum Card was tied to an empty shell account. 4 minutes later, the doors opened again. The manager stepped back into the room, but his rigid posture had shifted. His shoulders were slightly stiff, and his expression was a carefully constructed mask of customer service neutrality. He did not hold the leather folder high this time. He kept it close to his side as he walked briskly past the extended relatives directly toward the head of the table. The loud celebratory conversation continued, completely oblivious to the subtle change in the atmosphere. The manager stopped right next to Andre. He leaned down very close, keeping his voice respectfully low to maintain discretion. He whispered something directly into Andre's ear. I watched Andre's face carefully. The charismatic, confident smile froze instantly. His dark eyes widened for a fraction of a second, registering genuine shock before he quickly forced the arrogant smirk back onto his lips. He let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded incredibly hollow and deeply forced. It echoed awkwardly across the dining room, causing several relatives to pause their conversations and look over. "It is just a ridiculous fraud alert from traveling," Andre announced, projecting his voice so everyone at the table could hear his perfectly crafted excuse. "You know how these high-tier banking security algorithms are? They see a massive restaurant bill, and they immediately freeze the account for my own protection. It happens all the time when you move as much capital around as I do." He waved his hand dismissively at the manager, acting as though this was merely a tedious inconvenience for a man of his vast wealth. Sydney nodded vigorously, immediately buying into the lie. She smiled at the aunts across the table, rolling her eyes in mock annoyance at the burdens of being so incredibly rich. Andre reached into his tailored designer jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. He extracted a different credit card, this one solid black metal, and tossed it onto the silver tray with a heavy thud. "Just run the black card," Andre commanded, his voice dripping with arrogance. "That one has no limit anyway. I will call my wealth manager in the morning and have them sort out the platinum account. Please make it quick. We have more celebrating to do." The general manager nodded politely, taking the silver tray and exiting the room once again. The table quickly resumed their loud chatter, accepting Andre's explanation without a single shred of doubt. Carol even boasted to an uncle about how secure Andre's accounts must be to trigger such elite fraud protection. But I saw the truth. I saw Andre reach for his crystal water glass with a hand that was visibly trembling. He took a massive gulp, his throat working hard to swallow. The sweat on his temple had returned, and he was no longer making eye contact with anyone at the table. He was staring fixedly at the white tablecloth, calculating his rapidly diminishing options. This time the wait was significantly shorter. Barely 2 minutes passed before the oak doors swung open. The general manager did not walk slowly or discreetly this time. He marched directly to the head of the table, his face devoid of any accommodating warmth. He did not whisper. The bill was resting open on the tray alongside the black card. "Sir," the manager stated, his voice clear and ringing through the sudden quiet of the room. "I apologize, but this second card has also been completely declined by your issuing institution. The error code indicates insufficient funds, not a security hold. We require an alternate form of payment immediately." The entire room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. The soft classical music playing from the ceiling speakers suddenly sounded overwhelmingly loud. Every single eye at the massive table locked onto Andre. The charismatic, invincible mask he had worn all evening completely shattered right in front of them. His jaw hung slightly open, his dark eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. He was completely cornered. The illusion of the brilliant tech billionaire evaporated, leaving behind a desperate sweating fraudster in a loud designer jacket. Sydney looked at her husband with absolute horror. Her face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of crimson as the extended relatives stared at them in profound shock. The golden child who had just spent the last 2 hours bragging about her limitless wealth was suddenly sitting next to a man who could not even pay for the birthday dinner he had so arrogantly claimed. She shrunk back into her heavy leather chair, desperately wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Richard, realizing that his entire family was being publicly humiliated in front of their relatives, shoved his chair back and stood up. He shot a frantic, glaring look at Andre before turning to the general manager. He forced a tight, strained smile onto his face, attempting to project the authority of a wealthy patriarch. "This is clearly a massive institutional banking error," Richard declared, his voice overly loud to compensate for the crushing embarrassment. "Andre just secured millions in funding today. The banking servers are obviously struggling to process the massive capital transfers. I will not have my family subjected to this ridiculous incompetence." Richard pulled out his own premium credit card, the one tied to the very last of his available credit lines, and shoved it aggressively onto the manager's silver tray. "Run my card," Richard ordered, breathing heavily. "I will handle this bill for my son-in-law tonight, and he can reimburse me tomorrow when his bank fixes their pathetic system. Bring the receipt back quickly." The general manager took Richard's premium card without a word and turned to leave the room for the third time. The silence at the main table was agonizing. Nobody spoke. Nobody drank their wine. They just sat there, suffocating in the thick, heavy tension of the moment. I sat perfectly still in my dark corner, my hands resting on the Vanguard Holdings dossier. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just waited for the ultimate corporate guillotine to drop. I knew absolutely exactly what was going to happen when the manager ran that third card, because I knew exactly where Richard's money had gone. The financial slaughterhouse was completely ready and waiting for them. The silence in the private dining room stretched into an unbearable eternity. Nobody dared to speak or even reach for their water glasses. The extended relatives stared at the heavy oak doors, waiting for my father to be proven right. Richard sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, exuding a false sense of absolute authority. He genuinely believed his premium credit card would resolve the humiliating situation Andre had created. I knew the exact opposite was true. The massive $500,000 wire transfer Richard had authorized earlier that week to fund Andre had flagged his entire financial portfolio. Traditional banking algorithms do not ignore sudden massive extractions of home equity, especially when transferred to unregistered offshore cryptocurrency accounts. The system had automatically locked down every single line of credit attached to his name. Exactly 3 minutes later, the doors swung open for the fourth time. The general manager stepped into the room holding the black leather folder with a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He did not walk to the head of the table with deference. He marched toward my father with the stern posture of a man catching dine and dashers. He placed the folder flat on the white linen tablecloth right in front of my father. "Sir," the manager said, his voice slicing through the dead air, "your card has also been declined by the issuing bank. The error code specifies a hard freeze on all associated accounts due to suspicious high-volume transfer activity. We cannot process this transaction." The color drained completely from my father's face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out ghost. He stared at the small printed slip of paper resting inside the leather folder, as if it were written in a foreign language. "That is entirely impossible," Richard stammered, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of his entire extended family. "I have an impeccable credit rating. I have been banking with that institution for 30 years. Run it again. Call the authorization line directly. Tell them who I am." The general manager shook his head firmly, refusing to touch the card again. "I have already spoken to the Merchant Authorization Center, sir. They confirmed the hard freeze is absolute. Your accounts are locked globally. We need another form of payment for this $15,000 bill immediately, or I will be forced to involve the local authorities." The word authorities dropped into the room like an explosive device. "Carol," my mother let out a sharp, gasping wheeze. Her hands flew to her chest, clutching the expensive pearl necklace she had bought on credit just for this party. She began to hyperventilate, pulling in short, ragged breaths that sounded like she was suffocating on her own manufactured pride. "Richard, what is happening?" Carol cried out, her voice shrill and panicked. "Why are your accounts frozen? Where is the money we pulled from the house?" She turned her wild, desperate eyes toward Andre, who was shrinking back into his chair, desperately trying to avoid her gaze. The financial contagion was spreading rapidly across the table, infecting every single person who had bought into the illusion. The aunts and uncles who had been praising Andre just 20 minutes ago were now whispering frantically among themselves, pulling their chairs slightly away from my parents, as if financial ruin were a highly contagious disease. My father picked up his useless premium card, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice before finally shoving it back into his wallet. He looked at Andre, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. The $500,000 was gone, his credit was frozen, his entire life savings had vanished into the black hole of Andre's fraudulent startup. Andre did not say a word. The loud, charismatic tech visionary had been reduced to a silent, sweating coward. He refused to look at my father, staring instead at the remains of his imported caviar. The majestic birthday feast had officially transformed into a public execution. The sheer weight of their collective embarrassment was suffocating them. They had invited their entire social circle to witness their elevation to the absolute top of the financial hierarchy, and instead they were publicly defaulting on a restaurant bill like common criminals. They were completely trapped in a nightmare of their own meticulous creation, and the walls were rapidly closing in on them from every possible angle. Sydney could not handle the destruction of her perfect spotlight. Her 29th birthday was turning into a legendary family disgrace that would be whispered about for decades to come. Every single photograph she had forced the photographer to take earlier in the evening was now completely tainted by the absolute humiliation of this exact moment. She looked at her silent husband, then at her hyperventilating mother, and finally at her humiliated father. The reality that she was married to a broke fraudster was too much for her fragile ego to process in real time. She needed a scapegoat to survive. She needed someone to absorb the immense shame radiating through the room so she could desperately cling to her false status. Her eyes darted wildly around the table before finally landing on me, sitting silently in my dark corner. Sydney stood up, knocking her heavy chair backward with a loud, aggressive thud. She pointed her finger directly at my wine-stained sweater, her face twisted in a mask of pure, desperate malice. "Make her pay!" Sydney screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "She has been sitting over there taking up space and drinking our water all night. She probably planned this whole thing to sabotage my birthday. Make her pay the entire bill. Or just leave her here to wash the dishes like the homeless trash she is. She can scrub the pots until she works off the $15,000. We are not going to sit here and be humiliated because of some stupid banking glitch. Make her pay. Make her pay." The shrill echo of my sister's voice bounced off the wood paneling. Sydney stood pointing her manicured finger at my chest, her face contorted into a mask of desperate entitlement. She genuinely believed throwing me to the wolves would erase the fact that her husband was a fraud and her parents were bankrupt. She wanted me to absorb their failure so she could cling to superiority. The extended relatives stared, expecting me to break down. My mother Carol shot me a look of pure venomous hope. My father Richard gripped the table, waiting for me to take the fall. I did not reach for my purse. I pushed my chair back from the overflow table and stood to my full height. The dark red wine stain covering my cashmere sweater felt like heavy armor. I kept my posture rigid and my expression devoid of emotion. I picked up the Vanguard Holdings dossier and held it securely at my side. I walked with deliberate steps toward the center of the main table. Every eye in the room tracked my movement. They expected a victim. They expected a homeless dropout begging for mercy or offering to wash dishes. As I approached the head of the table, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open one more time. The general manager of Le Rêve stepped back inside, but his entire demeanor had shifted. He was no longer playing the role of the polite, accommodating host. He walked with a rapid, urgent pace, bypassing the waiters and completely ignoring Richard, who had his hand raised to complain. The manager did not even glance at Andre. He marched straight toward me and stopped exactly 2 feet away. The manager dropped his rigid posture and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional respect. He clasped his hands together in front of him and looked at me with genuine concern. "Is everything all right, boss?" he asked, his voice clear and ringing through the suffocating silence of the room. "Do you need me to have security clear this table immediately?" The word boss dropped into the center of the room like a heavy concrete block. It shattered the remaining fragments of their arrogant reality. My father lowered his raised hand, his jaw falling slack. Sydney lowered her pointing finger, her eyes darting frantically between me and the manager. Carol let out a short, confused gasp, gripping the edge of the table as if the floor was tilting beneath her. Andre stared at me, his dark eyes wide with absolute horror as the final pieces of his impending destruction began to slide perfectly into place. "Excuse me," Richard stammered, his voice shaking with a mixture of confusion and lingering arrogance. "You are speaking to my daughter. She is unemployed. She is not your boss. You are clearly confusing her with someone else. Address me. I am the one trying to resolve this ridiculous banking error." The manager stood up straight and looked down at my father with an expression of absolute Arctic coldness. "I am not confused, sir," the manager stated firmly. "You are currently speaking to the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Holdings. She is the primary stakeholder of the luxury hospitality group that manages Le Rêve. She signed the acquisition papers 6 months ago. She owns this restaurant. She owns the staff. She owns the very building you are sitting in right now." The total paralysis that swept over my family was a terrifying thing to witness. Sydney collapsed back into her heavy leather chair, her face completely drained of color. The sister she had just assaulted with a glass of wine was actually the supreme owner of the most exclusive establishment in the city. Carol covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with a sudden crushing realization of her monstrous behavior. She had spent the evening bragging about cutting off my college funds and praising a con artist while sitting inside a real estate asset that I legally owned and operated. Richard looked at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a terrifying alien creature. His brain simply could not process the vast gap between the homeless dropout he thought he was humiliating and the corporate titan standing right in front of him. "You own this building!" Richard whispered, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the revelation. "You bought Le Rêve. How is that even possible? You do not have that kind of capital. We cut you off." I looked down at my father, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, professional detachment. "You cut off my tuition, Richard," I corrected him, using his first name to sever any remaining illusion of family loyalty. "You did not cut off my ambition. You abandoned me when I realized corporate law was too restrictive. I took the scraps I had left and built an empire of distressed debt acquisition. Vanguard Holdings controls over $2 billion in real estate and private equity assets across this city. I bought this hospitality group 6 months ago because I liked their revenue projections. I let you make the reservation tonight because I wanted to see exactly how far you would go to impress a man who is actively stealing your life savings." The extended relatives sitting around the massive table were completely speechless. The aunts who had mocked me, the uncles who had praised Andre, they were all staring at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep, suffocating embarrassment. They realized they had spent the entire night aligning themselves with a broke, fraudulent criminal while actively insulting a legitimate billionaire. The power dynamic in the room had completely flipped upside down and crushed them underneath its immense weight. I did not need their validation. I did not need their conditional love. I owned the ground they were standing on. And the trap I had set for Andre and my parents was just beginning to snap shut forever. The heavy oak doors at the back of the private dining room swung open for the fifth and final time tonight. My executive assistant Michael stepped into the room, breaking the paralyzed silence that had suffocated my entire family. He moved with the silent, ruthless efficiency of a corporate shark. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that made Andre's flashy designer jacket look like a cheap, embarrassing costume. Michael did not look at my parents. He did not look at my sister. He walked directly to my side and handed me the heavy black leather briefcase he had just retrieved from my armored vehicle waiting outside. The Vanguard Holdings insignia was pressed deeply into the premium leather surface. I placed the briefcase flat on the main dining table, right next to the remnants of Sydney's extravagant gold leaf birthday cake. I popped the dual combination locks with two sharp metallic clicks that echoed loudly in the dead silent room. I lifted the lid and extracted the sleek black folder. I handed the empty briefcase back to Michael, who took a protective stance slightly behind my right shoulder, ready to intervene if anyone tried to stop me. Before I opened the dossier, I reached deep into the pocket of my ruined cashmere sweater. My fingers found the crumpled $50 bill my father had thrown at my chest earlier in the evening when he banished me to the corner. I pulled it out and smoothed the wrinkled paper between my fingers, deliberately taking my time. I took 2 slow steps toward Richard. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He was staring at a total stranger. The obedient failure he thought he knew had vanished completely. I dropped the $50 bill directly onto his plate, right on top of the picked-over bones of his imported Wagyu steak. "Keep it, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly freezing whisper. "You are going to need it." I turned my attention back to the sleek black folder. I opened the cover and folded it back, exposing the dense financial forensics my compliance team had compiled over the last few days. I looked across the table at Andre. The charismatic salesman who had confidently pitched his fraudulent empire 20 minutes ago was physically shrinking into his heavy leather chair. The sweat on his forehead was gleaming under the bright chandelier light. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Sydney reached for his arm, but he pulled away, entirely focused on the documents in my hands. "Let us talk about Apex Property Solutions," I announced, projecting my voice so every single extended relative could hear the absolute truth. I looked down at the first page of the audited report. Andre, you pitched a decentralized algorithmic trading protocol designed to tokenize commercial real estate portfolios. You promised 20% monthly returns based on algorithmic market disruption. That was a very entertaining speech. Unfortunately for you, and for the people who blindly trusted you, my private equity firm actually conducts basic due diligence. I pulled a certified bank statement from the folder and held it up for the entire room to see. "There is no real estate technology platform," I stated firmly. "There is no proprietary algorithm. There is no blockchain integration. Your company does not own a single line of original software code. The entire technological infrastructure of Apex Property Solutions consists of a basic website template that costs $14 a month to host. You do not employ a single software engineer. You do not hold any patents. There is absolutely no tech app. You built a digital mirage designed exclusively to separate gullible people from their life savings." Sydney let out a strangled gasp, shaking her head violently. "That is a lie," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure desperate denial. "Andre showed us the app. He showed us the dashboard with all the property investments. He has an office downtown. You are just jealous and trying to ruin his reputation." I looked at my sister, feeling a brief flicker of pity for her profound ignorance. "He showed you a static graphic interface, Sydney. It was a fake dashboard populated with dummy numbers generated by a simple spreadsheet. And that office downtown is a shared co-working space he rents by the hour to run meetings with potential victims. It is a stage set." I turned the page in the dossier, moving to the forensic accounting breakdown. I looked directly at my mother and father. Carol and Richard were clinging to each other, their faces pale and drawn, their arrogant pride completely shattered. You bypassed your retirement funds and took out a massive second mortgage on the family home, I said, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy. You wired $500,000 in raw cash to Andre's corporate account exactly 4 days ago. You thought you were securing a lead investor stake in a billion-dollar unicorn. You bragged about it all night. Let me tell you exactly where your $500,000 went. I continued, tapping my finger against the highlighted ledger. At 9 in the morning on Tuesday, your funds cleared the Apex Property Solutions intake account. At 9:15, Andre initiated a wire transfer moving $400,000 to an offshore cryptocurrency exchange based in the Cayman Islands. At 10:30 that same morning, he transferred the remaining $100,000 to a private wealth management account heavily tied to an illegal online sports betting syndicate. I looked back at Andre, who was staring at the table, unable to make eye contact with anyone in the room. He did not buy distressed digital assets, I announced to the horrified crowd. He bought high-risk, volatile crypto coins that immediately crashed, and he used the rest to cover his massive pre-existing gambling debts. Your entire investment was completely wiped out within 3 hours of the wire transfer. There is zero capital left. The company accounts are completely empty. That is exactly why his platinum card and his black metal card declined tonight. He is entirely broke, and he dragged you down with him. I let those final words hang in the heavy air of the private dining room, allowing the absolute devastation to sink into my parents' minds. I reached into the sleek black folder and pulled out a stack of papers bound by a heavy silver clip. These are the certified bank records, I announced, holding them up so the harsh chandelier light caught the official notary seals stamped across the bottom of each page. I did not hack into your accounts, Andre. I did not need to. When you operate a fraudulent shell company and attempt to solicit investments from legitimate institutional firms, you leave a massive digital footprint. Vanguard Holdings employs the most ruthless forensic accountants in the country, and they tore your entire financial life apart in less than 48 hours. I separated the top document from the stack and tossed it directly onto the white linen tablecloth in front of my father. Read it, Richard, I commanded. Look at the routing numbers. Look at the destination accounts. That is the exact trajectory of the $500,000 you stole from my grandfather's legacy. You thought you were funding a real estate technology empire, but you actually funded a desperate man's offshore cryptocurrency wallet. I pointed to a specific line on the document. Right there on page 3, you can see the secondary wire transfer. $100,000 routed through a Cayman Islands proxy directly into a high-stakes sports betting syndicate. He did not buy property. He bought virtual chips at an illegal online casino, and he lost every single penny of your money before you even sat down to order your expensive appetizers tonight. The profound silence in the room finally shattered. Andre slammed both of his hands onto the table with such violent force that several crystal glasses tipped over, shattering against the fine china. "Shut up!" Andre roared, his voice completely losing its polished, charismatic tone. He sounded like a cornered, desperate animal. He shoved his heavy leather chair backward and lunged to his feet, his eyes wild with panic and fury. "You are lying!" he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You fabricated these documents. You printed them out to frame me because you are a bitter, jealous failure who cannot stand seeing a successful black man thrive. You are trying to destroy my marriage and my company with fake papers." He took a sudden, aggressive step toward me, his large frame towering over my position. He reached out violently, attempting to snatch the Vanguard Holdings dossier right out of my hands to destroy the evidence. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I just stood there perfectly calm and let my security detail do exactly what I pay them to do. Before Andre could even close the distance between us, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room burst open. 4 massive men dressed in identical black suits rushed into the room, moving with terrifying synchronized speed. They were the elite private security team for the hospitality group, and they answered exclusively to me. Two of the men grabbed Andre by his shoulders, spinning him around and slamming him forcefully back down into his leather chair. The impact knocked the wind completely out of him. A third security guard stood directly behind him, pressing a heavy hand onto Andre's shoulder to ensure he remained pinned to the seat. The fourth guard took up a defensive position right next to Michael, forming an impenetrable human shield between me and the disgraced fraudster. I watched his desperate eyes dart across the room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. "Do not move another muscle, Andre," I warned, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "If you attempt to touch me or these legal documents again, my security team will physically restrain you on the floor until the police arrive. You are currently trespassing in a building that I own, and I will gladly press charges for the assault." Andre sat paralyzed in his chair, his chest heaving as he stared up at the massive security guards flanking him. The fight had been completely physically drained out of him. He was a broken man, stripped of his flashy designer armor, exposed entirely as a desperate criminal. Sydney let out a high-pitched wail of absolute horror. She pressed her hands against her temples, staring at her husband as if he had just morphed into a terrifying monster. "Andre, tell them it is a lie." Sydney begged, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. "Tell them you have the money. Tell them the app is real. Please. Andre, tell them she is making this up." Andre could not even look at his wife. He kept his eyes glued to the polished hardwood floor, his jaw locked in silent, humiliating defeat. He had absolutely no defense left. The certified bank records resting on the table were an undeniable, ironclad death sentence for his fake empire. My mother Carol covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly. The sound of her weeping echoed pathetically across the dining room, a harsh contrast to the arrogant laughter she had projected just an hour ago. Richard, my father, looked like he was going to be physically sick. He picked up the bank statement I had thrown in front of him, his hands trembling violently as he read the highlighted routing numbers. He traced the lines of the offshore wire transfers with his finger, his eyes wide with a crushing, terrifying realization. The money was truly gone. He had mortgaged his father's house, his entire financial safety net, to fund a criminal enterprise. And the proof was staring him right in the face, in stark black and white ink. "You gave him everything, Richard," I said, my tone merciless. "You handed over $500,000 without asking for a single audited financial statement. You did not demand a business plan. You did not hire a lawyer to review the corporate structure. You just blindly handed over a suitcase of cash because he wore a loud suit and fed your massive ego. You wanted to play the role of the wealthy venture capitalist so badly that you completely ignored every single massive red flag. And when I tried to warn you tonight, when I tried to stop you from making the biggest financial mistake of your entire life, you laughed in my face. You called me a homeless beggar. You told me to get out of the restaurant. You threw a $50 bill at me like I was garbage." I stepped closer to the table, my presence dominating the entire room. Every single extended relative was completely silent, watching the absolute destruction of my parents' false reality. "Well, Richard," I continued, my eyes locked onto his pale, devastated face, "the $50 bill you threw at me is the only liquid capital you have left to your name. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit cards are completely maxed out. Your retirement fund is non-existent. You are entirely bankrupt. And the absolute worst part of this entire situation, the detail that is going to keep you awake every single night for the rest of your miserable life, is knowing exactly who holds the deed to your house right now." The crushing weight of my final sentence hung suspended in the chilled air of the private dining room. I watched my father Richard process the horrifying reality of his situation. The last remaining drops of blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His eyes darted from the certified bank statements resting on the white linen tablecloth up to my face, and then back down to the documents. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped his throat. The arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life obsessing over social status and projecting an image of untouchable wealth was suddenly reduced to a hollow, terrified shell. Beside him, my mother Carol seemed to physically shrink into her heavy leather chair. Her manicured hands trembled violently as she gripped the edges of the table, her knuckles turning white under the strain. The absolute truth had finally breached the thick walls of their manufactured delusion. Their entire life savings were completely gone. The aggressive second mortgage they had blindly taken out to fund Andre was no longer a brilliant investment strategy. It was a massive financial anchor tied securely around their necks, dragging them straight down to the bottom of an inescapable ocean of debt. They had sacrificed my grandfather's home, the only genuine asset our family possessed, and handed it to a criminal who had already incinerated every single penny. The transformation of my mother was immediate and deeply pathetic. The woman who had proudly called me a failure, the mother who had gleefully bragged about cutting off my college tuition, the matriarch who had laughed out loud when Sydney threw a glass of red wine at my chest, vanished in a fraction of a second. In her place emerged a desperate, sobbing victim frantically searching for a lifeline. Carol pushed her chair back and scrambled to her feet. Her expensive designer heels stumbled awkwardly against the plush carpet as she rushed toward me. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup and leaving dark streaks of mascara trailing down her cheeks. "Oh my God, Clara!" Carol wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "My beautiful, brilliant daughter, please, you have to understand we were completely deceived. He tricked us. We had absolutely no idea he was running a scam." She reached out with both hands, throwing her arms forward in a desperate attempt to pull me into a tight maternal hug. She wanted to physically bridge the massive canyon she had spent decades digging between us. I did not move backward. I simply raised my right hand and held it flat in the air, perfectly rigid, establishing an impenetrable physical boundary. My private security team immediately stepped forward, but I signaled them to hold their positions. Carol hit my invisible boundary and stopped, her arms dropping limply to her sides. "Clara, please, you have to forgive us." Carol sobbed openly, weeping in front of the silent extended relatives. "You are so incredibly rich now. You are the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. You own this entire magnificent restaurant and the hospitality group. You have billions of dollars in private equity assets. $15,000 for a dinner bill is absolutely nothing to you. $500,000 is just pocket change for a woman in your powerful position. You can fix this entire nightmare with a single phone call. You have to help us right now." She grabbed the edge of my ruined cashmere sweater, her fingers clutching desperately at the wine-stained fabric. "If you do not help us clear this debt, your father is going to go to jail. The private lenders we used for the second mortgage were not a traditional bank, Clara. They are aggressive corporate creditors. Richard lied on the loan application about his liquid assets to get the cash quickly for Andre. When they find out the money is gone and he committed mortgage fraud, they will press federal charges. He will go to federal prison and we will be thrown out onto the streets. We will be completely homeless. You cannot let your own parents become homeless vagrants. You know how dangerous the streets are. You lived in a hotel because you chose to, but we will have nowhere else to go. We will lose all our friends and our entire reputation will be completely annihilated. You must fix this." I looked down at my mother's trembling hands gripping my stained sweater. I reached over and peeled her fingers off my clothing one by one with slow, deliberate precision. I smoothed the fabric and took a half step back, putting a safe distance between my success and her toxic desperation. Richard remained glued to his chair, entirely paralyzed by the mention of federal prison and mortgage fraud. The proud man who had just thrown a crumpled $50 bill at my chest was now weeping silently, tears pooling in the deep wrinkles around his eyes. "Clara, please." Richard begged, his voice a pathetic, broken whisper. "I will do anything you want. I will publicly apologize to you in front of the entire family. I will get on my knees, right here in this restaurant." Just please use your company to pay off the private lender, buy the debt from them, and forgive the loan. You have the power to save our lives. You are the only one who can save this family from absolute destruction. You owe it to your grandfather's memory to save the house he built. Do not let his legacy be destroyed by my foolish mistake. We are begging you for mercy. We are your blood. We are the ones who raised you. Please help us. Do not leave us to rot in a federal prison cell. I stared at their weeping faces, soaking in the absolute magnitude of their sudden catastrophic downfall. They were entirely at my mercy and awaiting my final ultimate judgment today. Richard remained firmly planted in his heavy leather chair, his chest heaving with desperate, shallow breaths. The man who had spent my entire life dictating the terms of my existence was now reduced to a trembling beggar pleading for a financial bailout. He clasped his shaking hands together, resting them on the pristine white tablecloth, directly beside the pile of crushed Wagyu beef and my discarded $50 bill. "Please, Clara," my father whispered, his voice breaking under the crushing weight of his impending federal prosecution. "I know we were wrong. I know we treated you horribly. But you have the capital. You have the corporate infrastructure. You can just buy the debt from the private lender and wipe it clean." He leaned forward, his eyes wide with a frantic, pathetic kind of hope. "The lender we used is incredibly aggressive, Clara. They are a shadow private equity firm, known for predatory lending practices and ruthless asset seizure. We went to them because traditional banks refuse to process a second mortgage that quickly, without intense collateral verification. I was so blinded by Andre and his promises of 20% monthly returns that I lied on the loan application. I inflated our liquid assets and falsified our income projections just to get the $500,000 pushed through their approval system. If this private lender discovers the money is completely gone and that the application was entirely fraudulent, they will not just foreclose on your grandfather's house. They will immediately hand the file over to federal prosecutors for wire fraud and mortgage fraud. I will die in a federal penitentiary. You have to wire them the funds tonight. You are the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar empire. You can absorb a $500,000 loss without even noticing it. Buy the debt, Clara. Pay off the private lender and save my life." Carol nodded vigorously beside him, wiping her smeared mascara with the back of her trembling hand. "Yes, Clara. Please," my mother pleaded, her voice thick with manufactured desperation. "You have to save the family home. It is the only legacy your grandfather left us. You cannot let some faceless corporate entity tear it away from us and sell it to the highest bidder. You have the power to stop this nightmare. Just use your company to make the payoff, and we will owe you our lives. We will do whatever it takes to make this right." I let a long, heavy silence fill the private dining room. I looked at the extravagant crystal chandeliers hanging above us. I looked at the terrified faces of the extended relatives watching this spectacular collapse. Then I slowly lowered my gaze back to my father. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the polished mahogany table. The cold detachment in my chest hardened into absolute solid ice. "You want me to pay off the lender?" I asked, my voice echoing with a lethal, quiet authority. "You want Vanguard Holdings to step in and absorb the $500,000 debt to save you from federal prison?" Richard nodded frantically, tears spilling over his lower eyelids. "Yes. Clara, please. I will do anything." I held his desperate gaze, refusing to let him look away. "Dad, who exactly do you think you borrowed the money from?" The question hung in the air, freezing the blood in his veins. His frantically nodding head stopped abruptly. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The complete inability to comprehend the sheer magnitude of my statement paralyzed his vocal cords. I reached into the sleek black Vanguard Holdings dossier and extracted the final, highly sensitive document. I placed it gently on the table, sliding it perfectly straight until it rested inches from his shaking hands. It was the original promissory note for the predatory second mortgage. At the very top of the page, printed in bold black ink, was the logo of Obsidian Financial Partners. You went to Obsidian Financial Partners because they approve high-risk loans in 48 hours, I stated coldly. They do not ask questions. They just require absolute collateral. You thought you outsmarted the traditional banking system by using a shadow firm. You thought you could bypass all the rigorous federal background checks and secure a massive pile of raw cash before anyone noticed your deteriorating financial status. But you clearly failed to read the fine print on the master agreement. I tapped my manicured finger directly on the corporate disclosure printed at the very bottom of the contract. I made sure my fingernail rested exactly below the registered corporate entity clause. Obsidian Financial Partners is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings. I announced my words, striking him like physical blows. I own the shadow firm that issued your predatory loan. I am the faceless corporate entity holding the deed to my grandfather's house. The color that had just barely begun to return to his face vanished completely. He stared at the corporate logo on the contract and then slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. The absolute horror radiating from his pupils was magnificent. He realized he had walked directly into the jaws of the very daughter he had spent decades trying to destroy. When your fraudulent loan application crossed my desk for final executive approval 3 weeks ago, I recognized the property address immediately. I explained, dissecting his failure with clinical precision. I saw your inflated liquid assets. I saw your falsified income projections. I knew you were committing federal mortgage fraud to secure that $500,000. Any other financial institution would have flagged it and reported you to the authorities right then. But I personally approved the underwriting. I authorized the wire transfer because I knew exactly where that money was going. I knew you were giving it to a man running a Ponzi scheme. I knew he was going to burn it all on offshore crypto accounts and illegal gambling syndicates. I deliberately funded your own absolute destruction so I could legally purchase the house you did not deserve to keep. I stared at him, letting the crushing reality of his total financial annihilation settle deep into his bones. You begged me to pay off your creditor, Richard, but you failed to realize the absolute depth of the trap I built for you. I am the only creditor you have left in this world, and I do not offer financial mercy to people who treat me like disposable trash. And I do not offer financial mercy to people who treat me like disposable trash. The absolute finality of my statement struck my father with the force of a physical blow. He slumped back against the heavy leather chair, his shoulders collapsing inward as the last remnants of his fabricated pride evaporated into the chilled air of the private dining room. I reached into the sleek black Vanguard Holdings dossier one final time. My movements were slow and meticulously calculated, designed to maximize the agonizing suspense radiating from every person seated at the massive table. I withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue seal. I did not toss them. I placed them deliberately onto the white linen tablecloth, sliding them forward until they rested directly over the crumpled $50 bill my father had thrown at me earlier. Let us review the exact terms of the financial suicide pact you signed, Richard, I said, my voice echoing with clinical precision. When you bypassed traditional banking regulations to secure $500,000 in raw cash, you agreed to the aggressive stipulations of a predatory corporate lender. You signed a contract containing a massive early balloon payment clause. You genuinely believed Andre was going to deliver a 20% return on your investment within the first 2 weeks. You calculated that you could use his fabricated tech startup dividends to easily cover that initial balloon payment and keep the shadow lender completely satisfied while you reaped the endless rewards of your supposed financial genius. I leaned closer to the table, locking my eyes onto his pale, terrified face. But as we have already established tonight, Andre did not generate a 20% return. He generated an absolute total loss within 3 hours of receiving your wire transfer. He incinerated your capital on offshore cryptocurrency exchanges and illegal sports betting syndicates. Because that money vanished, you had absolutely zero liquidity remaining in any of your accounts. Therefore, when the automatic withdrawal for your first massive balloon payment initiated yesterday morning, It bounced. It bounced hard across every single frozen credit line you possess. My mother, Carol, let out a sharp whimpering gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Sydney sat frozen in her chair, her eyes wide with mounting horror as she realized the golden safety net of our parents' wealth was completely gone. I kept my focus entirely on my father, ensuring he absorbed every single syllable of his destruction. In the corporate lending sector, missing a balloon payment of that magnitude on a high-risk subprime loan does not trigger a polite phone call from a customer service representative, I explained coldly. It triggers an immediate, automatic default. The second that payment failed to clear, Vanguard Holdings legally assumed total aggressive control over the collateral you provided. We do not offer grace periods. We do not negotiate extensions with clients who commit federal mortgage fraud on their initial applications. We execute the contract exactly as it was written and signed. I tapped my manicured index finger against the heavy blue seal binding the legal documents on the table. What you are looking at, Richard, is not a warning. It is not a late notice. It is the official, certified notice of foreclosure. A specialized asset seizure team from my firm filed these exact papers with the county clerk this morning. The property no longer belongs to you. The house my grandfather built with his bare hands, the home you recklessly leveraged to feed your pathetic obsession with social status, is now permanently registered as a distressed corporate asset under the Vanguard Holdings portfolio. The sheer magnitude of the devastation finally broke through Richard's paralysis. He reached out with shaking, violently trembling fingers and pulled the notice of foreclosure toward his chest. He stared at the bold black lettering, the official county stamps, and my corporate signature authorizing the immediate seizure of his only remaining asset. A low, agonizing sob tore out of his throat, sounding like a dying animal trapped in a snare. He looked up at me, tears streaming freely down his wrinkled face, begging silently for a reprieve he knew he was never going to receive. You gambled Grandpa's house on a con artist because you wanted a son you could brag about, I said, delivering the final, devastating blow with absolute icy detachment. Now you have neither. The words sliced through the dining room, severing the final thread of their manufactured family dynamic. Sydney let out a piercing shriek of pure panic. She turned violently toward Andre, her fists clenched. "You ruined us!" Sydney screamed at her husband, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You told us you were a billionaire. You told me we were going to be the most powerful family in the city. You stole my parents' house and you lost everything." Andre tried to shrink away from her furious assault, but my security team maintained their iron grip on his shoulders, keeping him firmly pinned to his seat. He was completely trapped, unable to charm his way out of the total financial annihilation he had orchestrated. He looked at me, his dark eyes filled with a potent mixture of raw fear and overwhelming defeat. He finally understood that he had tried to run a cheap hustle on a woman who commanded a billion-dollar financial empire. Carol grabbed my father's arm, shaking him desperately. "Richard, do something!" Carol wailed, her voice echoing off the expensive wood paneling. "Tell her to stop the foreclosure. Tell her we will pay it back. We can sell the cars. We can sell the jewelry. We can fix this." But Richard just sat there holding the notice of foreclosure, weeping silently onto the legal pages. He knew the cars were leased. He knew the jewelry was bought on credit cards that were now entirely frozen. They had absolutely nothing left to sell. Their entire existence was completely and utterly ruined today, forever. The illusion of family loyalty disintegrated the moment the financial reality set in. Sydney could no longer maintain the delicate posture of a wealthy socialite. The pristine image she had curated for her 29th birthday was lying in jagged pieces across the dining room floor. She spun violently toward Andre, her perfectly styled hair whipped across her face as she launched herself at the man she had proudly flaunted just an hour earlier. "You lied to me!" Sydney shrieked, her voice tearing through the room like shattered glass. "You told me we were buying a mansion in the hills. You told me I would never have to worry about a price tag again." She balled her hands into tight fists, and began striking him repeatedly against his chest. Her diamond rings snagged against the fabric of his flashy designer jacket, tearing the expensive silk threads. "You are nothing but a broke, pathetic fraud. You used me to steal from my own parents. You ruined my life." Andre tried to shield his face, raising his arms to deflect her frantic blows. He did not apologize. He did not try to comfort his wife. His dark eyes darted frantically around the room, assessing his rapidly shrinking options. The charming tech visionary was completely gone. Only the cornered criminal remained. "Get off me!" Andre snarled, shoving Sydney backward with enough force that she stumbled into the edge of the heavy wooden table. She gasped, clutching her side as tears of genuine shock and humiliation spilled down her cheeks. He did not spare her a single glance of remorse. His self-preservation instincts had entirely overridden any manufactured affection he ever held for her. Carol watched her golden child get shoved aside by the man she had elevated above her own flesh and blood. The shock finally broke through her paralysis. "How dare you touch her!" Carol screamed, lunging forward to catch Sydney before she hit the floor. "We gave you everything. We gave you our home. We trusted you." Richard remained glued to his chair, weeping silently over the foreclosure documents, but the anger slowly began to overtake his despair. He slammed his fist down onto the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "You stole my legacy!" Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "I will kill you myself. I will tear you apart." The extended relatives who had spent the entire evening kissing up to Andre now openly turned on him. Aunts and uncles shouted accusations, demanding to know if the smaller investments they had promised him earlier were also gone. The entire private dining room morphed into a vicious, chaotic courtroom where every single person was screaming for his head. The family that had prided itself on perfect appearances and elite social status was now tearing each other apart like starving wolves over the scraps of a slaughtered reputation. I watched the implosion from my position at the head of the table, completely untouched by the frenzy. I stood perfectly still, a silent conductor, orchestrating the beautiful symphony of their absolute destruction. They had built their entire world on a foundation of lies and greed. All I had to do was remove the floorboards and watch them consume themselves. Andre realized the immense danger of his current situation. He was surrounded by a furious mob of betrayed relatives and trapped in a room guarded by my elite security team. The fake bravado he relied on to con his way through life completely evaporated. He shoved his chair backwards so violently that it crashed onto the carpet. "I am not going down for this!" Andre shouted, backing away from the table. He looked at Sydney, who was sobbing hysterically in her mother's arms, and scoffed. "You people deserve to lose everything. You are so greedy and so desperate to look rich that you practically begged me to take your money. You handed it over because you wanted to brag. Do not act like innocent victims now." With that final cruel insult, Andre turned his back on his wife and bolted for the heavy oak doors. He lowered his shoulder, attempting to barrel his way through the blockade, but he severely underestimated the men I employed. My security team did not even flinch. The two massive guards stationed at the exit stepped forward, instantly closing the gap. Andre crashed into them like a small car hitting a solid concrete wall. The impact echoed through the room. One guard grabbed Andre by the collar of his ruined designer jacket, while the other swiftly swept his legs out from under him. Andre hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, agonizing thud. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp wheeze. The guards pinned his arms behind his back, holding him firmly against the ground with clinical professional precision. "Let me go!" Andre gasped, struggling uselessly against their immense weight. "You cannot hold me here. This is kidnapping. I will sue you all." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the struggling fraudster. I looked down at him, pinned to the floor of the restaurant I owned. "You are not going to sue anyone, Andre," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, chilling calm that silenced the screaming relatives. "You are going to need every ounce of energy you possess just to survive the federal indictments coming your way." I slowly raised my left arm and checked the face of my understated platinum watch. I noted the exact time with immense satisfaction. By the way, Andre, I added, looking back down into his terrified eyes. My compliance team did not just throw your fraudulent pitch deck into the shredder. We operate with a very strict mandate regarding financial crimes. I forwarded your entire business model, your fabricated financial statements, and your offshore routing numbers to the Federal Bureau of Investigation White Collar Crime Division yesterday morning. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him a pale, shaking mess on the floor. "You called the feds," he whispered, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "You set me up." "I did not set you up," I corrected him coldly. "I simply handed them the shovel you used to dig your own grave." Right on cue, the shrill, piercing wail of heavy sirens pierced through the thick walls of the restaurant. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect through the front windows, casting an eerie, chaotic glow into the private dining room. The authorities had arrived exactly on schedule. The trap had officially snapped shut, and there was absolutely no way out. The deafening sound of the approaching police cruisers sealed his fate, confirming that his fraudulent empire was completely dismantled and his luxurious lifestyle was over forever. Two uniformed police officers and a pair of plainclothes federal agents strode through the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. They bypassed the stunned extended relatives and walked directly toward my security team, who still held Andre firmly pinned against the polished hardwood floor. The lead federal agent did not offer a polite greeting. He simply pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and read Andre his Miranda rights while aggressively locking the metal rings around the fraudster's wrists. Andre did not say a single word in his defense. The fight had entirely evaporated from his body. He hung his head in absolute defeat as the agents hauled him up to his feet and marched him out of the restaurant toward the flashing red and blue lights, waiting in the alleyway. The glamorous illusion of his billionaire tech startup vanished into the cold night air, leaving behind nothing but the stark, terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence. As the heavy doors swung shut behind the arresting officers, the atmosphere inside the private dining room shifted from explosive chaos to a heavy, suffocating dread. The extended family members who had spent the entire evening kissing up to my parents and praising Andre suddenly realized they were standing in the middle of a massive financial crime scene. Aunts and uncles began grabbing their coats and backing away from the main table. They muttered quick, awkward excuses, avoiding eye contact with my mother and father. They were abandoning the sinking ship with ruthless efficiency, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic humiliation and potential legal fallout. Within 3 minutes, the room was completely emptied of the audience my family had so desperately wanted to impress. Only Michael, my security team, and the remaining shattered fragments of my biological family remained in the room. My father Richard stared at the empty chairs surrounding the massive table. His entire social circle had just evaporated into thin air. He slowly slid out of his heavy leather chair and dropped directly onto his knees on the plush restaurant carpet. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had thrown a crumpled $50 bill at me just an hour ago was now kneeling at my feet, his hands clasped together in a posture of total surrender. Carol, my mother, immediately followed him, dropping to her knees right beside her husband. The expensive designer dress she had bought on credit pooled awkwardly around her legs as she stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Clara, please," Richard begged, his voice a harsh, broken whisper that barely carried across the room. "We have absolutely nothing left. The extended family will never speak to us again. The banks are going to take the house and seize our accounts. We do not even have enough liquid cash to rent a cheap motel room tonight. You have to let us stay with you. You have an $8 million penthouse and a luxury hotel suite. You have endless resources at your disposal. You cannot let your own parents sleep on the cold streets." Carol reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grasp the hem of my ruined, wine-stained cashmere sweater. Her face was a messy ruin of smeared mascara and flowing tears. "We are so incredibly sorry, Clara," she wailed, her voice cracking with raw, genuine panic. We were completely blinded by his lies and his flashy suits. We truly believed we were doing what was best for the family. You are our beautiful and talented daughter. You run this entire hospitality group. You could arrange for us to stay in one of your hotel suites long term. You could also hire excellent lawyers to help your father handle the legal issues related to the mortgage. We're willing to do anything you ask to work and support you in any way we can. We just hope you won't let us fall into a difficult situation without a place to stay. Before I could respond, Sydney quickly stepped forward and sat down beside our parents. The once favored child who had earlier thrown red wine at me was now in tears, looking up at me with an expression of regret. She clasped her hands together, mirroring our parents' pleading posture. "Clara, please help me," Sydney said, her voice trembling. "I've been affected by this too. Andre influenced me just like he did Mom and Dad. I had absolutely no idea he was running a Ponzi scheme. I thought he was a legitimate tech genius building a real empire. He lied to my face every single day we were married. I am totally broke, Clara. The premium credit cards are in my name and they are all completely maxed out. He ruined my credit score and destroyed my entire social life. I have nowhere to go. I cannot stay with his family and my friends will completely ostracize me when the news breaks tomorrow morning. You have to let me move into your hotel suite with you. We are sisters, Clara. We share the exact same blood. You cannot leave your own flesh and blood out in the cold. I will be your best friend. I will make up for everything I said earlier. Just give me a safe place to sleep tonight, and I promise I will change." I looked down at the three of them kneeling on the floor of my restaurant. I looked at the heavy tears streaming down their faces. I listened to their desperate, panicked pleas for mercy and sanctuary. For 33 years, I had craved their validation. I had desperately wanted them to look at me with pride instead of disgust. But standing there looking at them begging for my financial protection, I felt absolutely no emotional connection to them whatsoever. The bond had been completely severed by their own greed and cruelty. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, ensuring Carol could not touch my clothing. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my expression entirely devoid of sympathy. I looked directly into Sydney's weeping eyes and then shifted my gaze to my kneeling parents. "At the start of this dinner, you called me homeless trash and told me to get out," I said, my voice slicing through their sobs with absolute freezing precision. "You laughed when Sydney threw wine on me. You threw money at me like I was a stray animal begging for scraps. You told me I was a pathetic failure who did not deserve a seat at your table." I paused, letting the undeniable truth of their own cruel actions crush whatever tiny fraction of hope they still harbored in their chests. "I am just respecting your wishes," I concluded coldly, looking down at the broken pieces of my former family. "I do not house trash." I turned my back on their weeping faces, completely dismissing their pathetic existence. The harsh sound of their frantic begging faded into meaningless white noise as I stepped away from the massive dining table. The general manager of Le Rêve was standing by the heavy oak doors, holding the black leather folder containing the final receipt for the extravagant birthday feast. He stepped forward respectfully, presenting the bill to me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my favorite silver fountain pen. I flipped the folder open and looked at the astronomical $15,000 total. It was a massive sum for a single meal, but to me it was simply the cost of doing business. It was the absolute final price of my total liberation. I signed my name across the bottom of the receipt, comping the entire exorbitant dinner through my corporate expense account. I handed the leather folder back to the manager and looked him directly in the eyes. "I want these three individuals escorted out through the service exit," I instructed, my voice echoing with absolute undeniable authority. "Do not let them walk through the main dining room. They are permanently banned from Le Rêve and every single hospitality venue owned by Vanguard Holdings. If they ever attempt to set foot on my property again, you are to call the police and have them immediately arrested for trespassing." The manager bowed his head deeply. "Consider it done, boss," he replied, signaling for the security team to begin hauling my parents and sister to their feet. I did not stay to watch them get dragged out through the kitchen corridors. I walked right out the front doors of the restaurant, leaving the chaos and the shattered remnants of my biological family entirely behind me. The crisp, cool evening air hit my face instantly, washing away the suffocating stench of their greed and entitlement. Michael opened the heavy door of my waiting armored SUV. I stepped inside, sinking into the plush leather seat, and watched the glowing neon sign of the restaurant fade into the distance as my driver pulled away from the curb. For the first time in 33 years, my chest felt completely light. The toxic weight of seeking their conditional approval was permanently gone. 6 months passed in a blur of aggressive corporate expansions and absolute vindication. The legal and financial fallout from that fateful night at the restaurant was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Andre was currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting trial. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had easily dismantled his pathetic shell company within days of receiving my comprehensive dossier. He was facing over 20 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and running an illegal Ponzi scheme. The federal prosecutors were pushing for a sentence of 30 years in a maximum security penitentiary. All of his flashy designer suits and gold watches had been seized by the government to partially compensate the dozens of victims he had ruthlessly conned. My parents faced an equally devastating reality. When the automatic default triggered the foreclosure clause, Vanguard Holdings moved with terrifying corporate efficiency. The eviction notice was served and executed within 30 days. Richard and Carol were physically locked out of my grandfather's house, forced to watch from the sidewalk as my asset management team changed the locks and boarded up the windows. With their bank accounts entirely frozen and their credit completely annihilated, they had absolutely nowhere to go. Their elite social circle abandoned them instantly. The country club friends they had desperately tried to impress refused to answer their desperate phone calls, terrified of being associated with federal mortgage fraud. Today, my parents are living in a cramped, dingy, one-bedroom rental apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. They rely on discount grocery stores and public transportation, completely stripped of the arrogant, wealthy facade they worshipped their entire lives. Sydney suffered perhaps the most humiliating plunge from grace. The golden child who had assaulted me with a glass of vintage wine was now completely buried under the mountain of credit card debt Andre had fraudulently taken out in her name. Without my parents' financial safety net to catch her, she was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. She lost her expensive car, her designer handbags, and her massive diamond engagement ring. The last I heard from my legal team, she was working a minimum wage retail job at a discount clothing outlet, constantly dodging relentless phone calls from aggressive debt collectors on her cheap, prepaid cell phone. She spends her days folding the exact type of thrift store trash she once accused me of wearing. I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of my newly finished $8 million penthouse. The massive gut renovation was completely done. The custom glass railings and imported Italian marble floors gleamed perfectly under the fading light of the evening sun. I leaned against the cool glass, looking out over the sprawling financial district of the city I had methodically conquered on my own terms. I was wearing a brand new Loro Piana cashmere sweater, perfectly unbranded and woven from the finest wool in the world. The previous one had been ruined, but replacing it was effortless. I watched the tiny cars moving through the gridlock traffic far below my balcony. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no lingering anger. I felt nothing but a deep, profound sense of serene, unbothered success. They had tried to break me. They had tried to bury me under their toxic expectations and their vicious conditional love. But they had completely forgotten that a seed must be buried in the dark before it can aggressively take root and grow into something unbreakable. I had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from the scraps they threw away, and I had used that very same empire to teach them the ultimate lesson in consequences. Have you ever had to watch the people who broke you face the consequences of their own actions? Share your story in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the best revenge is unbothered success. The most profound lesson embedded in this story is that our fundamental worth is never determined by the conditional approval of those who actively refuse to see our true value. For years, the protagonist was subjected to the harsh judgment and toxic expectations of a family that measured success entirely through the superficial lens of loud designer brands and fabricated social status. They eagerly celebrated a charismatic fraud while brutally dismissing the quiet, resilient daughter who was actually building a legitimate empire. The vital lesson here is that seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you is an emotional battle you will never win. Instead of internalizing their cruelty or screaming to defend her honor in a room full of people who desperately wanted her to fail, she chose the most powerful response possible. She focused on silent, relentless execution. She understood that true wealth, both financial and emotional, does not need to desperately announce itself at a crowded dinner table. When we are faced with individuals who actively try to tear us down, our human instinct is often to fight back and loudly prove them wrong. This narrative teaches us that the ultimate victory lies in entirely removing ourselves from their toxic game. We must channel our pain into building our own impenetrable foundation, one so incredibly solid that malicious opinions simply bounce off it. By walking away from her family's manipulative dynamics, she did not just protect her physical assets, she protected her inner peace. Her unbothered success became the absolute mirror that forced her abusers to face their own devastating reality. Ultimately, we must learn to be our own greatest advocates, cultivating our success in the dark until it becomes completely undeniable in the light. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success? And if so, how did it change your life?